Welcome to everybody today. I'm Leslie. I know most of you. Leslie Vinjamori, I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. We have an extraordinary several months ahead of us. We've had an extraordinary several years behind us. Today's session is on the record. We are recording, so please be aware if you ask a question, which we certainly hope that you will be recorded, and we will be sharing this because we have a very prominent moderator and a very prominent speaker who will be in conversation with each other. This is part of a long-standing series that we have now on the future of conservative foreign policy and conservative politics in the United States, something that we consider to be extremely important to those of us trying to understand the US and its global role. No more important time than the present. I will say just a brief word about our moderator whose voice, if not physical presence, is very well known to anybody who listens to Radio 4 in the United Kingdom. Carolyn Quinn, one of Radio 4's greatest presenters, worked with the BBC from 1986 to 2023 in many roles. You will know her between 2004 and 2008 as a presenter on the Radio 4 Today program, from 2007 as a lead presenter on Westminster Hour, and also as a lead presenter for many years on Radio 4's PM. I was very fortunate to join you on a few occasions. The beginning of a friendship, and hopefully with a very long future. And we hope, Carolyn, that you will join us as much as we can persuade you to at Chatham House. You've already done some tremendous work for us, so thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And you equally have helped to enlighten listeners over the years, and we have shared some shocks and horrors in the studio. So without further ado, let me introduce the guest today, and he'll be joining us online. He is Gerald Saib, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who over many decades has overseen Washington coverage as Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires. He's also moderated 3 presidential debates and has interviewed every president since Ronald Reagan. So he is exactly the person that we need to hear from as we talk about the drivers influencing the Republican Party today, and talk about how the party is going to continue to develop post-2024. Gerald's book, his recent book, is called We Should Have Seen It Coming: From Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution. So, Jerry, can we just welcome you to the room? And I wonder if I could just kick off the discussion, because we're recording this and there will be questions from some of our guests here in the room as well as those online. But can I hog you for a little while at the start and ask you, as a long time, much commended Washington watcher, looking back over the time since you interviewed Reagan, for instance, the time when the US was viewed as the world's policeman, and there was that expansive Reagan-esque shining city upon a hill view of US global leadership, wasn't there, and internationalism. In your view, the Republican Party today, very different to the Republican Party then, yes. Why and what forces have driven the Republican Party away from internationalism, if you like, to nationalism or indeed isolationism?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you all, and I hope it is a conversation. And you know, that is the question. You've posed the question. In fact, it's the question that compelled me to write the book. We should have seen it coming, because after Donald Trump appeared on the scene, I asked myself, after having spent the previous 40 years covering a lot of the events in the Republican Party that preceded Donald Trump's arrival, how did this happen? You know, because it was not clear to me, even as a kind of a witness to history, how this had occurred. And the title of the book became "We Should Have Seen It Coming," because I realized, in retrospect, in the rearview mirror, that there were milestones along the way that should have warned us that a kind of a populist, nationalist, neo-isolationist sentiment was building up within the Republican Party, and that would burst to the surface eventually. And it's not one factor, but I think there was concluded a series of factors. The first one was the change in the very makeup of the Republican Party. I mean, there was over time a migration into the Republican Party for cultural reasons. A lot of working class voters who were not the traditional Republican voters who produced a party that was internationalist in outlook. These were working class voters who moved into the Republican Party mostly for cultural reasons, not for economic reasons even, and certainly not for international reasons, but things like abortion and gay rights and a sense that there was a kind of a liberal woke attitude emerging in the Democratic Party pull those people into the Republican Party. And these were people who didn't have a stake in the global economy and in the internationalism that had prevailed in the party. So they became a much bigger force within the party. At the same time, there was a surge of immigration. And I went back and looked and was surprised at the numbers. The number of undocumented migrants in the United States actually doubled during the 1990s. And I think people in Washington, where I'm sitting now, we're less concerned about this than working class voters out in the country were. And these were, as I said, the working class voters who now had become more important within the Republican Party. I think third, the admission of China to the World Trade Organization was a big event, and again, bigger in retrospect than perhaps it seemed at the time. If you look at a graph of the decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States, that line begins to really go down at the very point China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. It had a very discernible effect that had, it soured people on economic globalization. And then that was followed by the Great Recession in 2008, in which I think a lot of voters concluded that Wall Street and the elites were bailed out, but normal people were not. People lost their homes, they lost their jobs. There seemed to be an imbalance, an inequality. Add to that two failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's another factor that I think doesn't get enough attention, which is amidst all this, the Cold War ended, right? I mean, the Cold War, the confrontation and competition with the Soviet Union was kind of the glue that held together both the internationalists and the isolationist wing of the Republican Party. Because the Cold War, the competition, the confrontation with the Soviet Union was the glue that kind of held together internationalists and neo-isolationists within the Republican Party. It masked over this divide in some ways because everybody could agree that competition with and opposition to the Soviet Union was paramount. When that went away, that glue kind of dried up and blew away. And I think that that had the effect of laying bare the kind of isolationist sentiment that was under the surface of the Republican Party since the days of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s.
You talk then about the economic change as well, the fact that more working class voters joined the Republican Party. But don't economic concerns affect all the parties? And for instance, if we now see a $60 billion package voted in to help fight the war in Ukraine, are there going to be voters in all the parties concerned about that amount of money going out? I suppose I'm asking you, is the isolationist tendency only in the Republican Party, or does it affect the Democrats as well?
It's a good question, and it's not only in the Republican Party. In fact, this is one of those places in the American political system where the left and the right kind of come together. There's certainly an isolationist strand in the Democratic Party, and it's always been there as well. The isolationist strand in the Republican Party is the one that has grown the most in the last few years. And if you look at that vote that you referred to over the weekend in Congress, which was a very important moment in this debate between internationalism and isolationism, all Democrats voted for that aid for Ukraine. A slight majority of Republicans in the House voted against it. So while there's some isolationist sentiment in the Democratic Party, I think you saw in that vote that it was much more prevalent right now in the Republican Party. In fact, there were a series of votes over the weekend. There were votes on aid for Ukraine, aid for Taiwan, aid for Israel, and then a package of other internationalist items. And there were 14 Republicans in the House who voted against all four of those. It was across the board, no to Ukraine, no to Taiwan, no to Israel. That's a sentiment you don't find in the Democratic Party in the same way these days.
Interesting, but you know, the Speaker, Mike Johnson, who'd held off, presumably because of the growing amount of pressure from within the Republican Party, he went ahead. And now, as far as Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene are concerned, you know, he is dead meat. Do you think he's going to suffer now as a result of that? And what impact will that have on the overall view of that aid package?
Well, he will suffer. He is suffering right now, and he may very well face in the next few weeks an actual attempt by his own party to throw him out, specifically and explicitly because he supported aid to Ukraine. He's made it very clear, I think to his credit, that he doesn't care. He's going to proceed doing what he has concluded is the right thing, which, by the way, is not what he thought was the right thing a couple of months ago when he first got this job. He's become convinced that Ukraine is a paramount issue. I personally don't think the effort to get rid of him is going to succeed this time. And it's precisely because Democrats, I think, having seen him stand up to the resistance in his own party to helping Ukraine, I think will now swing behind him and support him, and that should probably be enough to keep him in power. It will be an uncomfortable position if that's what happens, because he'll be a Republican speaker who owes his job to the opposition party. But he knows that, and that is essentially the path he has chosen. So I think it's a very interesting moment. And I think this is, you know, a rare moment in which Democrats and Republicans can actually come together and accomplish something.
If we're focusing on the Republican Party, Donald Trump, obviously, you know, he's many things, but he's not a Reagan Republican, is he? However, you know, do you think this shift towards more isolationist tendency and policy is a Trump-produced aberration? It sounds as if you think it's possibly been coming, you know, even before Trump was a twinkle in the voter's eye.
Well, I do think it was been coming. I think that the genius of Donald Trump was that he saw this moment and managed to seize upon it. But I do think that the elements were in the making for years, and somebody was going to step forward eventually and try to coalesce those forces into a kind of an America First moment. And that's really what Donald Trump did. And he did it very effectively, which is why I also think that if Donald Trump goes away, I don't think this sentiment goes away with him. I think the Republican Party has changed internally enough that you could have argued in 2015 or 2016 this was a Trump aberration. I think it's harder to make that argument right now because some of the brighter, younger, more forceful voices in the party, I'm thinking of senators like Marco Rubio from Florida or Josh Hawley from Missouri, even Tom Cotton from Arkansas, they're all kind of Trumpian, but a little more reasonable about it. But you know, and J.D. Vance is a new senator from Ohio. He fits into that category as well. These are people who have embraced elements of the Trump America First message, and maybe not quite to the extremes that Donald Trump carries it, but there's an element of let's protect ourselves, let's retreat, let's stop the wars abroad, let's take care of our borders first, that now runs through the Republican Party. So I think that if Donald Trump disappeared tomorrow, Trumpism, if that's a word actually, would not disappear with him.
Oh, interesting. You mentioned the failed wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and obviously that is going to affect a nation's view about do we put our troops out there? Do we put them in danger? Do we just, to quote Neville Chamberlain, now regard these things as quarrels in faraway countries between people of whom we know nothing? It's an understandable perception. However, if the United States isn't going to be the world policeman, are people happy for Xi to be world leader, or you know, God forbid, Putin. Do people think in those terms?
Well, many do, but not all do. And this is where I think two things become really important. One is that I think it is necessary for people, particularly within the Republican Party, by people I mean leaders, to actually articulate the case for American internationalism. You know, I did a piece for Foreign Affairs magazine a few months ago, and I talked to a whole series of former secretaries of state and national security advisors and defense secretaries from within the Republican Party, and posed this question to them: is the emergence of isolationism within your party now inevitable? And I think a lot of the answers I got back essentially were, it's not inevitable if we do a better job of making the case. We need to convince American voters that engagement in the world is not just an idealistic or a platonic idea. It is something that benefits them directly. That an America that has a leadership role, that has the dominant economy, that has that leads a world in which the dollar, for example, is the currency of choice. Those are all of immediate benefit to American voters, not just to people around the world. That is a case that has not been made particularly well. And so I think you need people who can make that case. And then secondly, I also think that you need people to see the alternative. In other words, they need to understand the alternative isn't some idealistic world in which we in the United States can just keep our hands off, but that there is a vacuum and that someone will step into that vacuum, and it will be either President Xi or President Putin. I'm saying that, you know, these arguments don't make themselves. Somebody needs to make them for the American people, to the American people, so that voters see American engagement in the world as beneficial to them, not just to others, not to foreigners or not to the elites, but to them. And I think that is a case that hasn't been made particularly well, if at all, and not particularly well at all in the Republican Party.
Is it a case that some will try to make if there's time before November the 5th? Because there's the battle for Congress. It's not just the presidential election, of course. People will be choosing their local representatives. Is there going to be much of an argument along those lines, do you think, from the Republican Party in the run-up to the elections?
Well, it's an important question. And I think it's important, first of all, to remember that though Donald Trump easily prevailed in the Republican primaries, there were others making the case for internationalism and making it quite explicitly. Nikki Haley certainly did. She spoke up for a kind of Reagan-style international engagement. And Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, did as well. Now, obviously, they got run over by Donald Trump, but there are voices in the party that were willing to stand up and make this case. So yes, there is an argument within the Republican Party for Reagan and Nixon style internationalism, first of all. And second, it is going to be important to see what happens in races for the House and the Senate. I think I think the louder voices are the voices that are calling for retreat, if you will, but they're not the only ones. And as I said, they're, you know, in the House, more than 100 House members, and they're all up for re-election this year, voted for aid for Ukraine. Now they're going to have to go out and make the case to voters in their districts before the election in November about why they think that was the right thing to do and an important thing to do. So you will have voices, and by the way, in the Senate, there is a majority of Republican support for helping Ukraine. Those are people who are all going to have to go out and make the case to voters. So you will hear people in the Republican Party make the counter argument. They will be doing that, though, at a time when Donald Trump is head of the Republican ticket and making the case for what I would consider to be a kind of a new neo-isolationist outlook on the world. So this tension within the Republican Party is going to be on full display this campaign season.
Interesting. Talking of campaign season, though, I can't resist asking you about the court case starting in New York on Monday. And already Donald Trump has been complaining that he's going to be caught up in court and not out on the campaign trail. What sort of impact do you think that will have on his chances? Do people need to see him to believe him, I suppose, or does the message get out despite the man?
Well, the message gets out regardless because Donald Trump has this gift to kind of be the center of attention at all times, and there's a certain amount of Trumpism that simply says all attention, all publicity is good, even if it's unfavorable, because that means people are paying attention to me rather than to somebody else, and that's a net good no matter what. And so far in his legal travails, that has actually been the case. That the fact that he is being prosecuted and in the eyes of his supporters persecuted actually makes the people who are the core Trump supporters support him even more fervently. So you don't see any diminution of his support, no erosion of support among his supporters, and in fact, perhaps even a hardening of it because of the legal complications. But I also think it's worth remembering that that's not the end of this story. You know, if we are in a situation between now in April and November when the election happens, in which he is actually becomes a convicted felon, which is a possibility, then I think everybody in the electorate has to step back and ask themselves a new question. And we did a poll, we, the Wall Street Journal, did a poll about 2 months ago in which we asked people the standard question, who are you supporting, Trump or Biden? And Donald Trump was up by 2 percentage points, 47 to 45, which is essentially a statistical tie. Then later in the same survey, we asked people, if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony, what would your vote be? And there was a decline of 3 percentage points in support for Donald Trump and an increase in 3 percentage points for Joe Biden in that scenario. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, right? But in a nation that is evenly divided, that's enough to make the difference. And in fact, in that scenario, Joe Biden becomes the leader in our poll, and Donald Trump is behind him. So I think there is ample room in the electorate for the legal problems to make a meaningful difference. It won't swing huge numbers of voters because nothing swings huge numbers of American voters these days. It seems a lot of people are locked in. But in the margins, it can make a difference. And this is an election in which the difference will be decided in the margins. So I wouldn't dismiss the possibility that this is a very serious threat to former President Trump. There are a lot of imponderables, and most things that we used to think, and people in my class, the journalistic class in Washington, used to think we understood and could predict, we don't understand and can't predict anymore. But I think it's fair to say there's a lot of room for peril for Donald Trump in these legal problems.
If he overcomes that peril, if he does prevail, if he does win, what can you foresee as the Trump foreign policy agenda? I mean, he said, hasn't he, that he could have sorted out the Ukraine dispute in a day. All the words that he said about NATO. But do you think the rhetoric would subside a bit? Do you think that he may have learned something from his first term in office that he could apply for a second term?
Well, you're always inclined to think with Donald Trump because you think of him as a normal politician in the first blush, that he will temper his rhetoric and that he will have learned something. But there's not a lot of evidence to support those two contentions, to be totally honest. I had an interview when I was doing the book with John Kelly, who was a former general who was Donald Trump's chief of staff in the White House for part of his first term. And he told a story about how then President Trump tried in a 2018 NATO summit in Brussels to withdraw the US from NATO unilaterally, to simply declare we're leaving NATO. And John Kelly rushed to the summit meeting room. He was off doing different other business at the time. So he walked into the room and talked Donald Trump at the table out of pursuing this idea of withdrawing from NATO. But I will tell you, General Kelly came away convinced that in a second Trump term, Donald Trump would actually try to do it, would actually try to withdraw from NATO. Now, is that just bluster? Is it something he could be talked out of again? I think the key question is who would staff a second Trump administration? Would the people around him be the kind of people who, as in the first term, were willing to say, stop, that's too much, that's too far. Let's temper the path that you're suggesting here. Or will he be surrounded by people who are as make America great again, America firsters as he is? I think that's an open question, and it starts with the question of who he'll pick as vice presidential running mate. So personnel is policy, as people in Washington like to say. I think it's really important. If you have, for example, someone like a Marco Rubio or Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State in his first term, as Secretary of State, these are people who are not going to would not allow the country to move to the more extreme fringes of isolationism.
Are there questions in the room? Because I have got a good, yeah, okay, I've got a very good
I
question
have a
online
question
as
as well.
well.
So whenever, I'll ask my whenever.
Yeah,
there's a
okay,
moment.
all right. Okay. I mean, the question online is his point about the American internationalism has to be sold in a better way, engagement with the public. How do you think that this could best be achieved? So that's a question online. I don't know if that echoes anything that somebody here wanted to ask. Did you want to ask that?
Yeah, that was very similar. So yeah.
Could you ask it then?
Sure, yes.
Because I'd rather.
Oh, there we go, we're back.
I think.
Perfect.
Hi, Jerry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying that things could get even Trumpier under.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I just switched to a different internet connection. So if the problem's on my end, maybe that will make things better.
Okay.
So yeah, as I said, my colleague Walter Russell Mead predicts an even Trumpier second term, if there is one, by which he means all the instincts and inclinations would not be tempered, but would be more extreme, because he enters as an angry man who feels he's been persecuted, and he'll never have to run for election again, and so he's liberated to be even more make America great again, America first. I'm not predicting that. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm just saying that is a view of a second Trump term. But I do think, as I said, the key question is who would be around Donald Trump. I don't think he'll change. I think he's the same person he was, 20, 30 years ago, essentially. The question is who's around him and can they constrain him? All
right. We're starting to get some interesting questions in, one in the room and one here online. You were saying that the case for American internationalism needs to be sold better to the isolationist part of the Republican Party. How do you think that can be achieved? And just to add to that, in the room, if you could just give your name and put your question, that would be great.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. I'm Julie Norman, UCL Center on US Politics. I had a very similar question just in how do you make that case, and especially in terms of interest rather than values for the United States?
Yeah, I think the case starts with the economic case, and it is essentially one that says you average American man and woman still benefit from economic globalization, even though it doesn't feel that way to you necessarily now. That the products you buy are less expensive because we still have open trade in not only goods, but components with much of the world. And I think it basically also has to be an argument that says American economic leadership creates openings for American products and goods and services. This is particularly true in the Farm Belt. I happen to be from Kansas originally. It is still the case that American markets abroad are extremely important to the heartland of the country. So this is not obvious to people. It has to be explained to them. And I think that's where the argument starts. The second argument that I think has to be made is one that Speaker Johnson actually made in a quite poignant way over the weekend, which is there's a history here in which American retreat from the world produces the need for America to get involved militarily in the world to stop bad things from happening. And Speaker Johnson said, "My son is going to enter the United States Naval Academy next fall. He'll be a midshipman. He's on his way to a career in the U.S. Navy. I don't want to send my son to Ukraine. I'd rather send U.S. military aid to Ukraine so that down the road we don't have to send U.S. soldiers to Ukraine to help stop Vladimir Putin." I think you have to make the case quite explicitly and almost in those terms so that people will understand it. So I think there's a security argument and there is an economic argument. I would add just as a third point, I think one of the things that is probably necessary is to explain that the U.S. can be engaged in the in the global economy without necessarily engaging with China as an economic equal. I think those days are over. I think people here in both parties and across the country think the Chinese have gamed the system, they've not played fairly, and that we're not going to go back to seeing the Chinese as a country that is going to play by the rules and operate in the same way we do. So I think you almost have to make an argument that the U.S. can be economically engaged around the world without engaging with China in the same way.
Thanks, Jerry. David Manning is a former British ambassador to the United States. I'm sure you've come across him in your time. He's also a distinguished fellow here at Chatham House, and he's got a question which is asking you whether you can pinpoint a moment when the Republican Party started to regard the Democrats as enemies rather than opponents. He says it seems there's little place in US politics for debate now and compromise, except in exceptional circumstances. Maybe we've just been discussing one of those. Does this go back to Newt Gingrich and Clinton, he asks? Are the Democrats equally to blame for the intense antagonism?
Well, I think in asking the question, he just gave the same answer I would. I do think there's a point when you can identify the tendency of Republicans to turn Democrats into the enemy. And it was the rise of Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. I mean, he brought Republicans to power in the House by banging away on the message that Democrats are not just wrong, they're evil, they're morally inferior. And that was stark and relatively new to American politics, at least in the modern era. So his argument was that Democrats and the left have harmed America, and their ideas are wrong and immoral and evil, and they have to be stopped. And what happens if you frame the argument that way is that you cannot really compromise with someone you have defined as evil. You can compromise with someone you disagree with. It's very hard to then argue for compromise with somebody who is morally suspect. And so that may or may not have been Newt Gingrich's intention, but that was the effect of what he did. And I think in the time since that became, and by the way, he succeeded in doing that. He brought Republicans back to power in the House in 1994 after they had been in the minority party for 40 years. So Republicans saw this and said, this works. We will pursue this line of argument. And in politics, anything that works is, of course, copied by the other side. And so you have Democrats subsequently making the same kind of arguments about Republicans. And then, again, once you're in that position, once you've defined the opposition as not just wrong, but immoral, then you have a hard time explaining to your own voters why you're compromising with this evil, immoral force that you've told them they should hate. So that's where we are, I'm afraid, in American politics.
Okay, no going back on that. I've got a couple of questions in the room now. So if you could say who you are as well.
My name is Terry Paddock, Chatham House member. Sorry, this might be a little making you repeat something you already said, but I'm fascinated by Speaker Johnson. And given how entrenched he was on Ukraine aid, what do you think was going through his mind that he did change his position, notwithstanding his son being at the Naval Academy? Yeah. And what might we learn from that?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer completely, but I do think this is one of those cases in which he actually listened, and this seems like an obvious point. Like, of course you listen to people, but there's not a lot of listening in Washington sometimes these days. But I think that he got in a room, in particular in the White House, a couple of times with President Biden, with Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, with Chuck Schumer, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, and with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House. And he heard them all say to him, history is watching us, and it's watching you in particular. This is a moment, and that the stakes of Vladimir Putin prevailing in Ukraine are extraordinarily high. Let us explain them to you. And I think that there's every reason to think that actually had an impact. That's the first factor. I think the second factor is that when you become Speaker of the House, you start to hear from the leaders of the U.S. intelligence community in a different way. You get briefings at a higher level. And remember, Mike Johnson had been a junior member of the House before he was, by a complete accident of history, vaulted into the speakership. I don't think he had been immersed in these conversations. I think he was on the outer edges of them. When you become speaker, you hear from the leaders of the U.S. intelligence community on a regular basis, and they describe the stakes of Ukraine to him. And I think all those things had an impact collectively. And I think, to Speaker Johnson's credit, as I said at the outset, there's every reason to think he actually listened. And he changed his mind. And I think he's getting credit among Democrats and among a lot of Republicans for doing that as well. Because one of the things he was able to do in changing his mind was bring to the forefront people in his Republican caucus who actually also thought the Ukraine case was a powerful one. And he's empowered the committee chairs beneath him who actually agree that Ukraine needs to be helped.
Thank you. Now we have questions in the room. I've said yes to you and yes to you. So quick question, if you could, please.
Thank you very much for this conversation. My name is Dominic Carrington. I want to go back to previous question about being rich Clinton and that thing. The quick question is, did that give rise to the internationalist neocon movement, which then failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, which then led to this tide of retreat? I've not had a chance to read your book yet where you may have explored this.
Thank you.
I missed the first part of the question. Are you referring to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yes, yes, of course.
Yeah.
So because the neocons were more internationalists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
there's freedom everywhere, and it didn't work.
Yeah, I think it I think it's a significant contributing factor, and I think it's not simple, because I think there was wide support at the outset for certainly the war in Afghanistan. And remember, the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq were both started by a Republican president, George W. Bush. I think what happened along the way were two things happened along the way. The first one was that neither war went well. Initially the war in Afghanistan was an easy war, but the aftermath was very messy, and the war in Iraq was never very easy. It was messy from the beginning. So I think that it both soured Americans on the idea that we can just walk out into the world and fix things. That's nation building was the phrase that was popular in the early 2000s. And I think people say, well, we're not going to engage in nation building. It's too hard. Let's just retreat. So that was the first effect. I think the second effect, which is more subtle but equally important, was a kind of decline in the belief in that the elites knew what they were doing. You told us we would fix Iraq, and Iraq still isn't fixed. You told us Afghanistan, once we got rid of the Taliban, would become essentially an American protectorate, and that hasn't happened. Maybe the people who tell us they know all about the world don't know what they're talking about after all. And so there was a kind of decline of faith in both leaders and institutions and the elites. And again, Donald Trump is brilliant at playing into those kinds of doubts. He comes onto the scene and says, you're right. They're lying to you. They don't know what they're doing, and they're deceiving you when they say that they do. So I think there was both a kind of a war weariness and a disillusion with the elites and the leadership that combined to make those wars one of the factors that pushed Republicans away from internationalism.
Thanks, Joe. Yes. Now I think you'll probably have to speak up. I'm not sure where the mic is, but if you say.
My name is Thomas. I'm just a Chatham House member, and I'm studying international relations at SOAS as a new Just a quick question on whether it will be more or less easy for Trump to execute his policies in a possible second term. He might be more Trumpier, and he'll know the mechanisms of government who just surrounds himself with. But what happens to the rest of the Republican Party? Will they rally around him, or will the Never Trumpers make it more difficult for him to execute policies? He may be more emboldened than a second term, but will he actually effectively be able to carry out his policies?
Well, it's a really good question. There are several layers to the answer, I think. The first is to keep in mind the ability of Trump to execute his policies depends, in the first instance, on what happens in Congress in the election. And we're in a very strange situation here in which it is possible that both houses of Congress and the White House could change partisan hands in the same election. That does not normally happen, but it is entirely conceivable the House could go from the White House could go from Democrat to Republican. The Senate could go from Democrat to Republican, and the House could go from Republican to Democrat. And it is very likely that the margins of control in the House and the Senate will be very small. It is not an environment in which it's easy for anybody, Donald Trump or anybody else, to get things done. So that would be the first break on Trump impulses. The Democrats will still have considerable power under this scenario, simply because government will be so evenly divided. So that's the first factor. I think the second factor is that, as I said, who's around Donald Trump really matters, and we don't know the answer to that question. And the third factor, the one that might make it easier for him in a second term to move ahead than otherwise, is the simple decline of the anti-Trump faction within the Republican Party. I mean, the people who are willing to speak up against him, and I'm thinking of people like Liz Cheney, Ben Sasse, who was a Republican from Nebraska, those kinds of people have either been marginalized or have simply thrown up their hands and left. And so the Republican Party that's left is more Trump friendly than the one that he inherited in 2016. So I think the Republican Party itself is less of a brake on his actions than it would have been in 2016, 2017, 2018. But I think the system is still a difficult one for anybody, Donald Trump or anybody else, to simply snap his fingers and work his will. There are a lot of brakes on the system, but those brakes come less and less within the Republican Party itself.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. A very quick question about the isolation if Trump win in the incoming election. What kind of isolation the foreign policy agenda will face in the Middle East among this conflict between Iran and Israel and so on?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because the Middle East stands out a little bit as an exception right now, simply because support for Israel within the Republican Party is very strong. It's very high. Part of this is traditional. Part of this is because Donald Trump was a fairly strong supporter of Israel when he was president. And part of this is because the evangelical Christian movement, which feels very strong bonds to the state of Israel and the Jewish people, is so strong within the Republican Party. So in a world scene in which Republicans seem to be retreating a bit from engagement, they remain engaged as powerful supporters of Israel. And I don't think that's going to change very much. I think the question there is how sophisticated is that support? In the first Trump term, the president, and probably more importantly his son-in-law Jared Kushner, pushed through the Abraham Accords, which basically started to build ties and relations, official and otherwise, between Israel and states in the Persian Gulf. I think a second Trump term would continue that and try to continue it anyway. At the same time, the Trump team was even more confrontational with Iran than the Biden administration has been, and that would probably continue as well. So there's a combination of forces in the Middle East that probably would keep Trump administration engaged as a supporter of Israel and therefore as an opponent of Iran. And I think that is a different picture than the one you see in Europe and than the one you see in Asia. And I think it's an important exception to note. So I'm glad you asked. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Robert Walter, I'm a former Conservative Member of Parliament here. I just want to follow on from basically the last two questions and look at what we in Europe here might regard as the Doomsday scenario, which is that Trump is elected with a more Trumpian administration, and he has control of both houses of Congress. He does a deal with Putin on Ukraine against the wishes of most of the NATO members, and maybe save Hungary or Slovakia. And then Putin is involved. And Putin then starts to threaten other European states and also enhances Assad in Syria because he has been the backer of Assad, and that is a threat to Israel. How does that administration respond to those new threats?
Well, I agree with you. That is the doomsday scenario, and I can't rule it out. I think that in the first instance, I think that the Trump approach to Putin is premised on the idea that he can control Putin somehow. I don't buy that myself, but if Donald Trump as president of the next 4 years finds himself in a scenario in which he's essentially ceded a third of Ukraine to Russian control, and that's what he essentially talks about doing, and then Putin moves on to the Baltics, let's just say. I don't know how he reacts in that situation because it will then be proven to the world that Donald Trump can't control Vladimir Putin, and he would be shocked and horrified by the embarrassment, if not by the actual results that presages. And he might react quite violently. He might decide that that Vladimir Putin has embarrassed me, so I will do to him what I do to anybody who embarrasses me, which is attempt to get back at them. Maybe that's the reaction. Maybe the reaction of Donald Trump in that instance is to essentially roll over and say, well, it's not our problem. I think that's an open question. I do think in the case of Syria and Assad, there is some evidence that, again, because of the core level of support for Israel, that a Trump administration would react and react forcefully to that scenario. I think that one of the problems here, and I'll just speak frankly, is that I think we're talking about scenarios that I'm not sure that Donald Trump has ever really thought through. I mean, he's a reactive person, and trying to predict how he would handle these things presumes he's thought through the questions, that he's looked around the corner and decided here's where this is going to lead, and here's what I'll do in that case. I'm not sure that that's correct. I think in the end, the idea of withdrawing from NATO, which is essentially would take us out of the Section 5 scenario in which we'd have to defend the Baltics, can't in the end be done unilaterally by a US president. I mean, as a treaty obligation, Congress would have a say. I don't think that would happen. And so I think in the end, the US would be obliged to defend its allies in NATO, whether Donald Trump liked it or not. And that would still happen. Am I 100% confident of that? No. But I think that's the more likely scenario, that you would end up with more bluster from Donald Trump than action. But I do think that the effect would be to embolden Vladimir Putin, and that can't lead to good places.
Leslie, you've got a question.
I do. I want to ask you about wealthy Americans, big business, tech, corporate sector, donors. A lot of people potentially stand to gain a lot from a Trump administration if he delivers on tax cuts, deregulation, but they also stand to lose from the inherent instability of having somebody like that making decisions in exactly the way that you've just described, in ways that we can't predict, might change, might not well be thought through. I mean, you're in Washington, you're talking to all of these people. What are they thinking? I mean, I heard somebody say, who's in finance, everybody's worried, everybody wants it to go away, and nobody's talking about it. But surely, given where we are now and given what they know and we know, there is a conversation, and not least amongst those who are deciding whether or not to back Donald Trump.
Well, so I will give you my impression of what I think the business community and the finance sector say to themselves. I think they say to themselves, we will support the Republican, whoever it is, because the two most important things to us are tax reductions and reductions of regulatory burdens. And then we will be confident we can control Donald Trump or whoever it is on the rest of the agenda, that we can suppress the rest of the agenda. That's what they told themselves in the first Trump administration. That's what I think a lot of them continue to tell themselves now. I think they may well be kidding themselves, but that's what I think they want. And I think in their minds, the primacy tax reductions and regulatory reductions it's so great that they're willing to take their chances on the rest of the agenda. So I think that's the prevailing view. I also will say, though, that there's been a significant change in the sentiment of the American business community because of the experience with China. Um, I think the idea that prevailed in the U.S. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that engagement with China would produce economic benefit across the board and the Chinese would play by the rules, is simply now dismissed in both parties. And I think the business community looks at this world and says, maybe a tougher line with China is okay. Maybe we're not as worried about that as we used to be. And at the same time, there's a kind of a sentiment in both parties that if the Chinese are going to play this game in a mercantilist way, in which they use subsidies and trade barriers, and they pick winners and losers, if you will, in the business community, and give government assistance directly to important industries, well, maybe we'll go along with that, and maybe our free market ideals shouldn't be as sacrosanct as they once were. So I think there's a kind of a hedging within the business community about the virtues of free trade, economic globalization, and free markets. And so I think there's a drift in that direction. I would also add as a final point, one of the problems the business community has is it is an orphan in the American political system right now. They have nowhere else to turn because the Democratic Party has moved to the left. It's Bernie Sanders' woke wing is openly hostile to businesses large and small. And so it's not as if the business community has an alternative. Well, we don't like Donald Trump, we'll turn to the Democrats. That's just not a viable option for them right now, given the state of the Democratic Party currently. So they're in a very much lesser of two evils stance in a lot of these things. And I think that's the other reason you see some business leaders biting their tongue, gritting their teeth, and deciding they can live with Donald Trump because they don't see an alternative for them anywhere else in the system.
Jerry, it ties in really with a question that's come in from Dina Mufti, who says, who is the alternative to Trump in the Republican Party if he does have to withdraw from the presidential race? Because I mean, that could change things substantially, yeah?
Well, that is a good question and an unanswerable question, because at the moment there is no alternative to Donald Trump. Now, at some point he has to pick a running mate, a vice presidential choice. A lot of people think Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina is the most likely choice for Donald Trump. Tim Scott ran against Donald Trump in the primaries, managed to pivot very nicely to becoming a Trump supporter as soon as he withdrew from the primaries, and is clearly angling to be the vice presidential nominee. So that's one possibility. The other possibility would be to turn to the person who was the most viable alternative to Donald Trump in the primary process, and that is Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina. Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, by the way, can't stand each other, so it's not as if there'd be some there wouldn't be some convergence, harmonic convergence in South Carolina, quite the opposite. And I guess the third possibility would be that you would have a wide open convention, and nobody could predict the outcome. Again, the problem is that there is no one alternative to Donald Trump, but I think either a Tim Scott or a Nikki Haley would be the most likely fallback option. But I don't think that's likely to happen anyway. I think Donald Trump would put his head down and bull through. The idea of him saying, this has gotten too messy, I just withdraw. I find that almost impossible to imagine.
And do you think it's now inevitable that it will be a Biden-Trump race? I mean, given the arguments that we've heard a lot about age and health, and Donald Trump falling asleep during the hearings last week, so can he still start? Use the Sleepy Joe argument. I don't know. I mean, what's your feeling? What are the people around you saying?
I think it is inevitable. I mean, barring some catastrophic health collapse from either the two main candidates, Biden or Trump, I think it's inevitable. I don't see a scenario. But it is also worth noting that it's not just Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. there are third-party candidates who will be on the ballot. You know, notably Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's on the ballot in a couple of states now, notably in Michigan, which is a difficult state for Joe Biden and an essential one for Joe Biden to win. And there's a Green Party candidate. There's Cornel West, who comes at Joe Biden from the left, and they're going to siphon away some votes. Right now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in our polling and other polls, draws almost evenly from Biden supporters and Trump supporters. So it's not clear that he tips the balance one way or the other, but there's a long way to go. And the history of third party and independent candidacies in the US is that whatever level those candidates have at this stage in the calendar diminishes significantly by the time you get to November and people decide they have to actually cast a vote that counts. But I will just say that it is not as simple a binary calculation right now. It's going to be more complicated than that, which again makes it extremely difficult to make firm predictions.
It's interesting, though, the reaction to the Kennedy independent standing. It hasn't gone down well with other members of the family or indeed with the Democrats. You know, what's made him do it? Does he think he could have an impact? Because he must have to think he's got a chance at least of making an impact.
Yeah, well, I don't know him particularly at all, but I do know some members of the family. I've talked to them, and I think they're mystified, to be totally honest. I think he wants to have an impact, but toward what end is not really clear because he brings a very eclectic mix of issues, you know, sort of anti-vax sentiment and skepticism about public health authorities, but very pro-environmental. Who's that supposed to appeal to? I don't really know for sure. And I think there's a tendency to think it's just a vanity play. And so he can make a difference. He doesn't seem to mind that he's going to make a difference, even if that difference is to help elect Donald Trump. It is interesting that the person who has the most positive things to say about him is former President Trump. Positive things to say about that tells you that the Trump campaign's calculation is that in the end, he would hurt Joe Biden more than he would hurt Donald Trump. And Democrats are petrified that that's the case. But I also would say nobody is sure.
Jerry Seib, thank you so much. What an interesting session that's been. And I'm so sorry we couldn't get through all the questions, but I think we'll have to organise another session to get through another bunch. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Thanks to Leslie as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn.